Hello and welcome to this episode of Extravagant Generosity, where we talk about how the spiritual practice of generosity impacts our communities, touches our hearts, and works for a more just world. My name is Andrew Warner, Generosity Outreach Officer for the national setting of the United Church of Christ. Today we'll talk about the way in which we can thank people all year round for their giving to our churches. It's really important that we're thanking people as often as we pass the plate, or perhaps even more. Thanking is a central part of the spirituality of generosity. In order to help us imagine that, I'm joined today by Jessica Shine, Generosity Officer with me at the national setting of the United Church of Christ. Jessica, when it comes to doing work within the church, can you help me imagine what it's like to thank people regularly?
Definitely, and thank you for having me. So think early, think often is a good kind of rubric to keep in your mind. One of the things that we used at the local setting when I was a local church pastor was really just that, to think early and think often. So we decided together that within the first week that someone had given a gift, we would thank them electronically if we had their email or through a handwritten note, but that within 7 days that they would get a thank you from us, just acknowledging that they took time to contribute to the mission of what we were doing. There were other ways beyond that we continue to express generosity. Something else that I find helpful is to differentiate between thanking and thinking. As a solo pastor or as a lead pastor, I found that I was thinking a lot about giving and thinking about the finances of the church. And it's not uncommon for the finance committee chair or for whoever happens to be responsible for collecting the offerings to be thinking about that, or to be thinking about the bills that are needing to be paid. But what felt helpful to me is to consider, how often am I thinking about finances, and am I telling people thank you as often as I am? So really the intentional shift from worrying about how do we get more money, to saying, how do we model generosity? How do we express gratitude for what we've been given and acknowledge that we have a core group of people who are aligned with the mission of the divine, with the mission of God in our community, and express that to them frequently and in ways that are meaningful.
Jessica, I'm really interested in this distinction between thinking financially and thanking generously. And it reminds me of a distinction I often hear between the mindset of scarcity and the mindset of abundance. In what ways do you find that the process of thanking people helps root you in a place of abundance?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think those are directly connected to each other. And it's interesting how much of Christianity has really been formulated around a scarcity mindset. And so for me, when I think about shifting to this place of abundance, it goes back to the gospel. It goes back to the heart of what I know to be true about Jesus and the Jesus story. And that is, there is this teacher who has radical welcome, who practices radical inclusivity, and one of the richest sacraments that we celebrate on a regular basis is the generosity of the gift of himself. And so if the local church is called to model that, then thanking people really helps us to shift our focus, again, away from worrying about the bills, worrying about what we need to do. Not that someone doesn't need to be paying attention to that. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying, though, is that it really shifts how we talk, how we think, and we can then move into, what are we here to do? Who are we called to be? And how do we become more of that community? How do we model that type of generosity in the way that we live, whether it's at our gatherings weekly, whether it's in our home, in our neighborhoods? And that kind of vision is captivating.
So Jessica, many local churches, both in the United Church of Christ and around the country and other faith communities, only send an acknowledgement of the gifts that someone has made to the local congregation once a year in January for tax purposes. So about 2/3 of churches, in fact, only acknowledge gifts once a year, which means that if someone completes their pledge, say in April or May, they won't hear for another 6 or 7 months about how the church noticed that they completed their pledge. Can you help me think about where does the church start if they want to be more thankful with their members and with their friends?
Right. Well, the best place to start in my perspective and my experience is always with leadership. And if you as the solo pastor, the lead pastor, if this is something you're wrestling with, or what are people going to think if we talk more about money? This is something that you have to be deeply convicted of. And the next place that I go in my mindset is pretty much any relationship we have. If I only acknowledge my spouse once a year, that would not be a healthy relationship, and it would not be a happy one either. And so a friend of mine, a colleague of mine, says, what gets rewarded gets repeated. And so the idea of generosity and of thanking people isn't about inflating the ego. It isn't about touting, someone gave a huge gift and everyone else is given smaller gifts. It's not about that. It's actually moving out of shame and moving out of obligation back into that directive, into that what I consider is innately human, into that generous spirit. And so some simple ways that it can happen are, first and foremost, to get it, if you're the solo pastor, the lead pastor, to get it clear in your heart. What is your vision? What is it that you see for the community that you have been entrusted to? And then it's really just as simple as creating a plan, whether that means working with your office manager or your treasurer to say, every Monday or every Tuesday, for example, this is what I would do is every week after the offerings were collected, our treasurer would send me the names of the folks who had given for the first time. And our office manager had prepared an email. And so I could personalize those emails. They were short, sweet, to the point. If we didn't have an email for those folks, I'd send a handwritten card because I wanted them to know, I see you. I see you. And even if it's just as simple as that, some way to begin to notice outside of the yearly cycle, and then to grow it into a weekly cycle. And there's all kinds of strategies we could talk about for how to do that.
Thanks, Jessica. That's really helpful for imagining how it is that we as pastors and leaders could be more expressive in our thanks to members and friends of our congregations. Just to summarize, if you're a church that only sends an annual thank you once a year, you might want to look at these opportunities to expressing thanks to members of your congregation. You can send a note thanking someone for a first-time donation or for making a pledge to your congregation. You can send a quarterly thank you so that every 3 months at least they're getting a thank you for their gifts. And of course, you want to send a thank you whenever someone completes their pledge to your congregation. These are just some of the ways that you can make saying thank you a regular part of the ministry of your congregation.